It really does feel like, watching India and China on the world stage, it's this kind of constant back and forth, isn't it?
Yeah.
We see those moments of, real tension,
Yeah.
especially along that border.
Right.
But then at the same time, there's all these calls for more dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
And recently, Prime Minister Modi himself has been talking about how crucial dialogue is for global stability.
Mm.
And I think that makes a lot of people wonder,
Absolutely.
what does this shift in tone from India really mean when it comes to their strategic interests, their security, in a region that, never seems to stay still for too long, and really just for the whole geopolitical landscape that, let's face it, we're all trying to wrap our heads around.
That's exactly the question we're going to be digging into today.
Okay.
We're going to do a deep dive on this whole India-China relationship.
Okay.
We've got some great analysis to work with, and we're going to be looking at their history, that long and complicated history, right? Those border disputes that just never seem to go away, the economic ties that bind them together, because let's be honest, they are pretty closely tied together when it comes to trade and things like that.
Yeah.
And then those external factors, because that's always the thing, isn't it, with international relations?
Right.
There's always somebody else kind of pulling the strings or at least influencing things. So our goal is to really unpack all of that so we can figure out what's really driving things here.
I think that's a great place to start because you can't understand the present without taking a good look back. So when we talk about India and China, the elephant in the room, or maybe the dragon in the room, is that border issue.
For sure.
It's a dispute that's been going on for decades.
Yeah.
So where did this all begin?
Well, the roots of it actually go all the way back to, colonial times, different interpretations of the boundary between British India and Tibet, because it wasn't ever a totally clear-cut line on a map.
Right.
A major turning point, though, was when China annexed Tibet in 1950. That was huge because suddenly you had China right there bordering India.
Right, and that set the stage for conflict, didn't it? Most notably, of course, the 1962 war.
It really did. I mean, the Sino-Indian War in 62, that was a major, major event. China ended up in control of Aksai Chin after that. And that's a territory that India still claims to this day. And I think that war, created this deep mistrust.
Yeah.
That's been very hard to overcome. I mean, you can feel the effects of that war even today.
Absolutely. And the tension didn't just magically disappear after 1962.
Yeah.
We've seen more recent flare-ups.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Right.
Two big ones come to mind. The Doklam standoff back in 2017. Remember that? 73 days, military face-off.
Yep.
China was trying to build a road in Doklam. Now, Doklam, it's not a huge area, but it's strategically very important. It's disputed between China and Bhutan. But because of where it is, it has a big impact on India's security, especially when you think about the Siliguri corridor, that narrow strip of land that connects India's northeast to the rest of the country. They did manage to disengage using diplomacy, but I mean, wow, that showed everyone just how quickly things can escalate.
Yeah, absolutely. And then more recently, we had that terrible clash in the Galwan Valley in 2020.
Right, Ladakh. That was a bad one. The deadliest clash between India and China in over 40 years. What really stands out about that one is that it was hand-to-hand combat. 20 Indian soldiers were killed.
Yeah.
China admitted to having casualties too, but we still don't know exactly how many. After that incident, relations just plummeted. It really ramped up the mistrust, and both sides started deploying way more troops along the line of actual control, which is basically their de facto border.
Right. It sounds like they have taken steps to de-escalate those since that incident.
They have. There have been a bunch of talks, both military and diplomatic talks trying to dial things down, and they have actually made some progress.
Okay.
They've disengaged from some of those friction points, particularly in 2023.
Okay.
But, and this is a big but, the root of the problem, the border dispute, that's still not solved. Both sides still have tons of troops along the LAC. So, yeah, the potential for more conflict is still very real.
It's a very tense situation for sure. But it's interesting, right? Because despite all this tension, all this history, India and China, they're also very connected economically.
It is kind of ironic, isn't it? It's one of the big contradictions in this relationship. When it comes to economics, China is India's biggest trading partner. In 2023, their bilateral trade was worth over $136 billion. That's huge.
Yeah.
But it's not exactly an equal partnership.
Right. There's a pretty significant imbalance in that trade relationship.
Oh, yeah. Big time. India imports way more from China than it exports to China. And that's been a worry for India for a long time. It raises questions about, dependence, vulnerabilities.
And after that border crisis in 2020, India did take steps to address that,
They did.
trying to reduce that dependence.
Yeah, they banned a bunch of those popular Chinese apps. Remember that?
Right.
And they tightened up the rules for Chinese investments, especially in sensitive sectors. And they've been pushing their Atmanirbhar Bharat initiative, which is all about making India more self-reliant.
But have those measures really made a big difference to the overall picture?
I mean, they're sending a signal. It shows that India wants to diversify. But let's be real, the relationship between the two economies is so intertwined, it's not easy to untangle that. You know, those Chinese goods, they're all over India's supply chains. Think electronics, pharmaceuticals, even telecommunications.
Right, so we've got this background of tension, especially over the border, and then this huge economic relationship, albeit a bit lopsided. Let's talk about diplomacy for a minute. Yeah. We heard about those informal summits a few years back.
Right.
What was the thinking behind those?
Those were interesting. The ones in Wuhan in 2018,
Yeah.
after Doklam, and then Chennai in 2019, that was Modi and Xi Jinping trying, well, I guess just talk.
Yep.
Improve communication, maybe try to understand each other a bit better. And I think they wanted to kind of reset things, really emphasize strategic communication so they could avoid those misunderstandings. And they talked about cooperation, you know, trade, investment, even global issues. It showed that India was willing to engage with China, even with all that baggage, those tensions.
But those talks didn't stop things from boiling over in Ladakh in 2020.
Nope, not at all.
So what does that tell us about the limits of diplomacy?
It shows that even when leaders get along, even when they make an effort, it's not a guarantee. When countries have really different geopolitical goals, things can still explode. It's a reminder that diplomacy is important, sure, but it's not a magic wand. You can't just talk your way out of every problem, especially when you've got these really fundamental disagreements.
So given this whole picture, all this history, these economic ties, and, well, the fact that diplomacy doesn't always work, what is India's game plan right now, especially with this renewed emphasis on dialogue?
Well, a few things seem to be guiding India's strategy. First and foremost, India really wants to grow its economy. They've got these ambitious goals, want to improve living standards for their people, and to do that, they need stability. And given how big and powerful China is, you know, a good relationship with China, or at least a stable one, that's just common sense.
Make sense?
Like their external affairs minister, Jaishankar, has said, it's just common sense.
But India is not putting all their eggs in one basket, though, right? We've seen them really engage with other partners, too.
Oh, absolutely. They're hedging their bets, for sure. I mean, it's very telling that while they've been softening their tone towards China, they've also been stepping up their engagement with the Quad.
Right. The U.S., Japan, Australia.
Exactly. And that really points to a strategy of, well, keeping options open, talking to China, but also building up those relationships with other major players in the Indo-Pacific. It's about balance.
Right. And the U.S., you can't really talk about all of this without talking about the U.S.
No, not at all.
What the U.S. does, that has a huge impact on how things play out.
Absolutely. And especially the way U.S. policy shifted under Trump.
Yeah.
I mean, on one hand, he slapped tariffs on China, which kind of lined up with some of India's concerns about trade. But on the other hand, his whole approach to alliances was really unpredictable. And that created a lot of uncertainty for countries like India.
So how did that uncertainty play out in India's thinking?
Well, when you hear talk about the U.S. cutting defense spending, putting more pressure on allies to do more themselves, you start to wonder how committed the U.S. really is to the Indo-Pacific. And then you've got Trump's way of dealing with things like Ukraine, or his willingness to make deals that could change the whole balance of power.
Right.
That makes everyone nervous, right? It forces countries like India to rethink their options, how much they can rely on other countries.
And India has relied on the U.S. for support in the past, even without that formal alliance.
Oh, for sure. They might be fiercely independent and non-aligned, but they've definitely benefited from U.S. intelligence, tech, and just general strategic support when it comes to dealing with China. So if the U.S. seems less reliable, well, it makes sense for India to try and secure its own position, figure things out with China directly as much as possible.
So what's next for India? How do they navigate this? It's such a tricky situation.
It really is a balancing act.
Yeah.
They've got to engage diplomatically, try to prevent things from blowing up again, see if they can find some common ground. But they can't forget about military strength. And it's a little worrying that India's defense spending, as a share of their GDP, has been dropping for a while. That's something they need to take seriously, especially with all the challenges they've got up on that northern border.
That is a bit concerning, especially when you look at how much China's been investing in their military.
Exactly. India needs to think long-term, invest in modernizing their forces, Submarines, fighter jets, new tech, all of it. Diplomacy is great, but you've got to back it up with strength. And no matter what happens with the U.S., with global alliances, India really needs to work with other partners too. Do exercises together, share intel, coordinate their strategies. That's essential.
So it sounds like what we're seeing is a pragmatic approach.
Yeah.
India is trying to manage this incredibly complex relationship with a mix of dialogue, strategic partnerships, and a credible military.
Exactly.
It's about finding a way to be stable without being vulnerable.
It's about not sacrificing strength for the sake of stability. Diplomacy is key, but you've got to have the muscle to back it up. That's how India can engage with China from a position of strength.
So for you, our listener, especially those of you studying for the UPSC exams, and this is a big one for those exams, this deep dive shows just how complicated things are between India and China. We've got the weight of history, these economic realities that tie them together, the delicate dance of diplomacy, and the role of the U.S., which is always a factor. You need to understand all of this. And sources like the Hindu, they provide that kind of in-depth analysis. So stay informed, keep thinking critically about these issues, and don't be afraid to look at different perspectives. It's crucial if you want to understand where India is headed in the region and beyond.
This brings up a really important question for all of you out there. India wants regional stability, they want to grow their economy, and they're talking to China to try and achieve those goals. But how can you tell if they're engaging from a position of strength, not weakness? What should you be looking for? What concrete actions, what developments in their military, their partnerships, and their diplomacy would tell you that India's got the balance right?
And for all of you UPSC aspirants, keep in mind that a solid understanding of these dynamics between India and China, this is super important for both your mains and prelims. We've used the kind of in-depth analysis you'd find in the Hindu.
Exactly.
So stay informed and keep digging deeper into these topics. If you found this deep dive helpful and have any questions or specific topics you'd like us to cover in the future, we'd love to hear from you. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave your comments and questions below. We're here to help you make sense of these complex issues.